Kathy.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Folk Horror Thursdays, a strand on my channel where I intend to talk about a variety of strange filmic curiosities, largely within the folk horror genre, but also including some slightly less folky horror films and some slightly less horror-y folk films. I was inspired to start this strand after watching the absolutely brilliant and pretty exhaustive folk horror documentary Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched from the recent Severin Films release All the Haunts Be Ours, which is a fantastic bumper box set full of folk horror oddities from around the world. I intend to slowly sink my teeth into its 20-some feature films over the coming months, and intend to dedicate several video reviews to the most interesting films in the set. For the first video in this series, however, I wanted to start with a much more famous work that I had not yet seen. A work that makes up 1/3 of the so-called unholy trinity of British folk horror cinema, alongside The Witchfinder General from 1968 and The Wicker Man from 1973. That film in question is The Blood on Satan's Claw. On paper, The Blood on Satan's Claw seems to have all the hallmarks of what I want out of a great 70s British horror flick. A historic rural setting, a satanic cult, probing uses of sex and violence, human sacrifice, and a somewhat isolated community at the mercy of something primitive, deadly, and beyond rational comprehension. It does have some unfortunate shortcomings, however, that hamper it from being as good as it could have been, but I'll get to those later. Right from the opening shots, I was pretty impressed by the interesting usage of low angles that make great use of strange perspectives to frame the scene of a young man who discovers an abnormal looking skull whilst ploughing a field. Once the opening credits started rolling, I was pleasantly surprised to see that the director of photography for this film was none other than Dick Bush, who has created stellar cinematography on no fewer than 6 of Ken Russell's works, including the electric rock opera Tommy, the erotic and neurotic Crimes of Passion, the hugely underrated artist biopic Savage Messiah, and the rather thematically twinned pagan horror cum Wildian vampire comedy classic The Lair of the White Worm, a film that I hold very close to my heart and which I will absolutely be covering on this channel in the not too distant future. But I digress. Dick Bush really does milk the most out of the gorgeous rural landscapes here, making sure that the film has a very grounded and earthy naturalistic feel to it. The impressive handheld camera work in some scenes certainly helps with this earthy grounding, in contrast to the steadier and much more staged fare of higher budget gothic horror films that British cinema had become accustomed to around the time. He also does a remarkable job in making sure that the set builds and interiors don't seem like set builds, since I had no idea myself that they were until I listened to the audio commentary track. On top of the stellar cinematography, the music by Mark Wilkinson and sound design by Tony Dorr were a pleasantly surprising mix too. There are no jaunty pagan sing-songs like in The Wicker Man, but the instrumental scoring here is certainly very fitting and in keeping with the film's intended atmosphere and setting. The acting talent isn't half bad too, with Patrick Wymark having some fun as the town magistrate turned witchfinder, Howard Jacob Gurney adding a touch of palate-changing humour to the mix in a minor role as a village doctor, and some credible performances from Doctor Who's Wendy Padbury and some others New Avam's Michelle Dotrice. It's Linda Hayden though who undoubtedly steals the show as Angel Blake, the film's central figure of the sweet teenage girl turned sinister cult leader, bewitched by the remains of a malevolent force to do its bidding and make it whole again through murder, manipulation and sacrifice. She is utterly entrancing on screen, and her presence subtly strikes the right balance between youthful purity and corrupted innocence, thanks in part to her hypnotising gaze. I find it interesting that the film is occasionally confused as being of similar ilk to a Hammer horror flick, as to me, with the exception of its period setting, it has a lot more in common with the much grittier new wave of British horror stuff that Pete Walker and Norman Warren are churning out, particularly when compared to the tonality of films like Satan's Slave and Frightmare. The timing of its release also makes the most of the newfound permissibility within British film classification, as it comes in the wake of violent and challenging films like A Clockwork Orange, Straw Dogs and The Devils, all having been released around the same time. The mixture of sexuality and violence within the film is pretty striking stuff, particularly considering that the children and teenagers within the village's cult perpetrate a lot of it. The film also well and truly earns its 18 certificate around the 50-minute mark, with a rather powerful, disturbing and uncomfortable scene of ritualistic sacrifice that kind of serves as the film's centrepiece. I won't spoil the contents of the execution of said scene, because even though I vaguely knew that it was coming, I was still quite taken aback by how far it actually went. It's definitely one of the film's strongest moments, as it's a scene of violence that is harrowing and effective, yet not overly exploitative or without meaning. In fact, one could argue that there is a significant amount of then contemporary politics weaved into the film's content. I won't pretend that I made the link all by myself between the violent content in this film and the infamous Mary Bell case, in which an 11-year-old girl murdered 2 preschool-aged boys in the Newcastle area in 1968, as this was already pointed out in the aforementioned folk horror documentary that I watched prior to this. But it's still an interesting observation to note and gives the film's scenes of child-on-child violence a bit of a political backbone. I since read that the screenwriter was indeed inspired by this case, as well as the cult-like mentality of the Manson murders which took place the following year. It certainly must have been a ballsy and edgy creative decision at the time to play upon people's anxieties of violent youth and cult mentalities for a horror film. It in turn reminded me of cases in the 80s and 90s where violent films and video nasties were often feebly cited as influencing factors in turning children into psychopaths, when in fact there have been numerous cases throughout history before the invention of cinema where kids have killed in horrific and disturbing ways. Of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Satan's Claw is not without its shortcomings. With the script's origins as 3 separate short stories that were hastily Frankensteined together very close to shooting, there are naturally some plot inconsistencies and conflicting ideas. It's mostly minor stuff like characters disappearing for certain portions of the film, but I did find it a bit odd that alongside the demonic anatomy discovered in the field that bewitches people who come into contact with it, there was also an evil in the attic of the magistrate's farmhouse that made people seemingly go mad and, in some instances, grow claws. That to me definitely felt like 2 distinctly separate ideas that could have done with a rethink instead of mixing together. The unintended benefit from this cobbling together of story elements, however, is that the pacing is quite unique. I quite like the little subplot of the girl who was rescued after being chased by villagers and thrown into the lake, as it avoided there being too much repetition of elements from the second third of the film, and felt like a welcome change-up, which still fit neatly into the main story. My biggest gripe, however, was unfortunately with the ending. Whilst the bar was set very high with the content of the aforementioned centrepiece, and the magistrate's promises that he will use undreamt-of measures to deal with the evil in this village, the execution felt too rushed and somewhat lacking for me. Without giving too much away, there is definitely an impressive build-up with the hypnotic and erotically charged atmosphere of the congregation, but then there is a distinct moment where it all falls apart, and the film even makes it obvious for you with a jarring couple of freeze frames and a switch up to slow motion. And the less said about the devil makeup, the better. It's certainly at odds with the otherwise grounded tone of the rest of the film, and somewhat results in the film kind of fizzling out in the last few moments. With a bit more conviction in delivering an ending that feels like a proper response to the arresting centrepiece, this would have been right up there as a horror masterpiece in my books. With that all being said though, I don't feel like it derails the film entirely, as there really is a lot to like here. It's a bold, ominous and very earthy work that, even with its aforementioned shortcomings, still absolutely deserves your full attention for everything that it does get right.